William Henry Harrison is President of the United States, but for less than 1 month. He dies of pneumonia, and his Vice President, John Tyler, is inaugurated to fill out the mule. Boosting the circulation of Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, which started publishing that same year. It is a time of great innovation and invention. The steam fire engine makes its appearance on the streets of New York, as does the first steamboat engine for screw-propelled vessels. America's fledgling foundry industry contributes to the parade of inventions in this era. Seth Boyden produces the first Blackheart malleable iron in 1826. And in 1841, the soon-to-be famous Connellsville Coke makes its appearance. Foundry arrived with plans for making America independent of European manufacturers, but the obstacles to be overcome are tremendous. For one thing, the English-trained molders prefer the sand brought from England as ballast, but the demand exceeds the supply, and deliveries are uncertain. The solution to this problem lies across the North River in New Jersey, where a peach farmer, Samuel Whitehead, thoughtfully fingers some soil from his orchard, and unknown even to himself, is about to embark upon an odyssey that will extend into the 20th century. 125 years of foundry sand and service to America's foundry industry. Samuel Whitehead's first contact with the foundry industry came about quite by accident. After delivering a load of his peaches to the New York City market, he stopped for refreshment at a nearby tavern, where he soon struck up a conversation with a gentleman by the name of J.L. Mott, who owned and operated a foundry on the Harlem River. Being an inquisitive man, Whitehead asked to see how castings were made. After touring the plant, Whitehead declared that he could supply the same type of sand that Mott was importing from England from his orchard in New Jersey. Mott was skeptical, but agreed to run some tests if Whitehead would bring along a sample on his next trip. Much to Mott's surprise and pleasure, Whitehead sand worked just as well, if not better, than the English import. Most historians agree that this was the first time molding sand was produced in the United States. Before long, peach production was abandoned in favor of sand exclusively, and by 1850, Whitehead had 7 sloops ferrying back and forth between New Jersey and his customers in the New York area. Meanwhile, improvements and new developments in the foundry trade continued unabated. In 1847, Asa Whitney perfected a method of producing chilled iron railway car wheels. The drop-bottom cupola came along in 1850. And a few years later, William Kelly started operating his first experimental steel converter. A British metallurgist, Henry Bessemer, hit upon the same inspiration almost simultaneously. But while the courts decided in Kelly's favor, the process became identified with Bessemer's name. To meet the differing needs of these new methods and the expanding demand of the new foundries which were opening, Whitehead vastly expanded his land holdings throughout New Jersey. At the same time, he brought his 5 sons, Charles, William, John, James, and Samuel into the business in order to give better and more personalized service to his rapidly expanding list of customers. The Civil War period brought increased demand for foundry products and consequently Whitehead sand. One customer was the Dallamatter Iron Works, which built the first of the North's armored battleships. Other early customers whose names are still well known today include Henry R. Worthington, E.W. Bliss, and Singer. To meet growing demand, the 5 Whitehead brothers, who had by now largely taken over operations from their father, added property at Northport Harbor, Long Island, and bought out an existing operation up the Hudson River at Peekskill. James continued farther upriver to the Albany and Cedar Hill areas, where rumors had it that an excellent molding sand had been discovered. For once, the facts proved to be better than the rumors. James didn't know it at the time, but his early land purchases were to lead to one of Whitehead Brothers' most famous products, Whitehead stoveplate molding sand. In its heyday, it was used in 90% of the stoveplate foundries in the United States. And even in this era of synthetic sand, many foundrymen insist on it for fine detail work like this artistic plate cast of gray iron. Today, by means of extreme close-up photography, we know that its strength is due to its unusual bonding substance. This clay, having originated from a portion of the body grain, has a strong affinity for it, and some of it is, in fact, part of the grain itself. In addition, the grains are irregular in shape and have pronounced interlocking tendency, adding a mechanical strength, as this washed sample illustrates. In the days of James Whitehead, however, decisions were made on the basis of practical experience, not microscopes. And letters like this one were testimony to the desirable, if little understood, qualities of Albany molding sand. The period in which we live has been called the soaring 60s and the sweeping 70s because of our enormous gains in population and economic growth. But if these headline writers were to go back 100 years, they might well have dubbed the 1860s and 70s as the steel 60s because of the tremendous gains made by this metal in those years. The first crucible steel casting was poured in 1861 at the Buffalo Steel Company. And the first open hearth furnace was installed in 1870. But with these new processes came new problems. The higher temperatures associated with steel casting required an extremely heavy-duty molding material. Whitehead Brothers began extensive explorations and finally located a suitable source in the Dorchester area of South Jersey. The grains are 99% silica and have the necessary high sintering point. The natural colloidal clay bonding material completely envelops the individual grains and lodges firmly in the serrated surfaces of the subangular grains. Despite 100 years of continuing exploration, very few districts in the United States have been found which produce such a high-quality, naturally bonded sand for steel casting. The fact that the first commercial steel castings on a large scale were produced in Philadelphia, close by the Dorchester area, is more than coincidental. Another first by another Whitehead customer was manganese cast steel, produced in 1892 by the Taylor Wharton Iron and Steel Company of Highbridge, New Jersey. The steel was used for railway crossings, frogs, and switch points, and was not only the first manganese cast steel in the United States, but also America's first cast alloy steel of any kind. Two notable events took place before the coming of the 20th century. In 1896, the American Foundrymen's Society was formed, thus signifying the coming of age of an industry. And in England, in 1898, two Lancashire chemists, Hargraves and Polson, obtained a patent for a CO2 process of hardening molds. Unfortunately, at that time, all molding sands were naturally bonded, and the thought of a synthetically bonded sand was too far advanced for its time. The idea died without even having the benefit of a foundry trial and did not appear again until after World War II. The major technological improvement immediately after the turn of the century was the electric arc furnace, which first made its appearance at the Holcomb Steel Company of Syracuse, New York. But for the most part, foundry development centered around mechanization to speed up production or improve quality. The mechanization came just in time. For World War I, the first modern war, made tremendous demands on foundry capacity. The war was over. But the hard-learned lessons of quality control to meet strict military specifications were remembered. Foundries were demanding that their sand be thoroughly screened to prevent fouling of mechanical sand handling equipment, and that grades be maintained with better uniformity. Recognizing that quality and service were just as important to the foundry as the sand itself, Whitehead Brothers decided that it was necessary to begin a program of laboratory control. Install screening and blending equipment, and standardize grades. This was particularly difficult in the Albany district because at that time operations were scattered over an area 125 miles long. Veins were shallow and near the surface, and root contamination was heavy in some banks. An intense period of experimentation followed, during which specialized machinery was developed, and operating techniques to meet the vagaries of the many different types of sand were worked out. The hard work paid off, and by the early 30s, the first large centralized screening plant was in operation, soon to be followed by portable units which operated deposits which were too small to justify a permanent plant. Thus began the era of the scientific approach to sand production and testing. It was in this same period that the drive to produce synthetic molding sand began. What foundrymen were looking for was a totally controlled product where the grains and the bonding agent were completely separate before mixing, so that the mixture would be reproducible time after time. While many persons were working on the problem in the early 20s, a U.S. patent was granted on January 31st, 1928, and assigned to Whitehead Brothers Company. The patent covers a molding compound comprised of a mixture of mineral materials, such as sand, with a clay having a minimum dye adsorption of 25,000. All clays having such high dye adsorption figures fall into the class of bentonitic clays. Thus, bentonite came upon the foundry scene. At the time the patent application was filed, bentonite was unknown to the foundry industry. But by 1928, when the patent was granted and the first ads appeared, 31 other companies were selling bentonite to the trade. While Whitehead Brothers had a legal monopoly, liberal licensing arrangements were soon worked out, and the entire foundry sand industry began the shift in emphasis from naturally bonded to synthetically bonded sand. By the late 30s, the transition to synthetics was so pronounced